People in Brookfield, Connecticut, used to share a curious piece of gossip about a woman named Marianne and a man named Peter. Their story, which started back in the late 1970s, became something of a local legend. If you ever stopped by the diner on Main Street or lingered too long outside the barber shop, chances were you'd hear some version of what happened between them. Folks would say they weren't sure if every detail was true, but they'd heard it passed around enough times that they figured most of it had to be real. The story itself wasn't written down anywhere, just told and retold, sometimes in hushed voices and sometimes with dramatic flair, until it felt like a secret everyone knew. Back in 1978, Brookfield was a small town with a tight-knit community. Marianne was only 20 years old then. She had big brown eyes and curly hair that she usually kept tied back with a homemade ribbon. She'd grown up on the outskirts of town in a modest house by Lake Wyndham, a pretty spot where the water stayed calm and reflective most of the year. It was said that Marianne's parents struggled financially, but they did their best to support their daughter. Her father was a part-time fisherman on the lake, and he also worked odd jobs at the local hardware store. Her mother kept the house neat and warm, making the most out of their limited means. Peter, who was a few years older, showed up in town around that same time. He'd moved from Massachusetts, people said, trying to find steady work after the local mill in his hometown had closed down. In those days, a lot of small mills and factories in the Northeast were struggling or shutting down. Peter was tall and wiry, with hands that always seemed to be stained by paint or varnish. Nobody knew exactly what he did for a living at first, only that he was fixing up an old boat by the lakeshore. He'd rented a small cabin with peeling paint and a half-collapsed shed out back, and he spent hours every day working on that boat, which was more like a leftover wreck than anything else. What drew Marianne to Peter initially, according to those who were around back then, was his quiet nature and the determination that shone through. There wasn't much to do for fun in Brookfield, aside from going to the drive-in theater or grabbing a milkshake at the diner, so Marianne occasionally strolled down by the lake just to clear her mind. One evening, she noticed this stranger hunched over a half-rotten vessel, carefully sanding away the old paint. She didn't intend to disturb him, but the clatter of loose rocks under her feet must have given her away. Peter glanced up. She apologized for startling him, but he just smiled and said he was used to unexpected noises. They chatted for a few minutes, introduced themselves, and that's how they first met. Near the water, paint cans scattered around, the fading light of day reflecting off the ripples in the lake. Marianne started dropping by more often. She wasn't particularly interested in boats or carpentry, but something about Peter's dedication kept her coming back. He had this dream of restoring the old motorboat so he could start a small lakeside service, maybe giving tours around Lake Wyndham for tourists or renting it out for fishing trips. At the time, nobody really believed that plan would ever work, because hardly any tourists came to Brookfield. But Peter was convinced he could make something out of the boat, and Marianne liked hearing him talk about possibilities. In a place where most young people felt stuck, Peter's ambition seemed refreshing. Within a couple of months, they were spending time together regularly. People would see them sitting on the dock, sharing a thermos of coffee, or walking around the edges of the lake, collecting colorful leaves that had drifted onto the shore. Marianne's parents were cautious at first, not knowing much about Peter, but his polite manner won them over, and soon he was invited to Sunday dinners. He would bring along a bottle of cheap wine or a bunch of daisies he picked by the roadside. Everyone in town started whispering that Marianne and Peter were a real couple, though no one said it to their faces in the beginning. By 1980, Marianne had turned 22 and found a job as a receptionist in a small real estate office downtown. Peter's boat project was nearly finished, but it still wasn't quite running the way he wanted it to. The engine kept stalling, and he had to save up for parts that were hard to find. After a while, he realized he'd have to work an additional job to afford it all, so he spent his mornings at the marina in a neighboring town, cleaning and repairing other people's boats. Late in the afternoon, he'd come back to Brookfield to continue fixing his own. It was around this time that Marianne, feeling a little restless, suggested they move in together. They rented a tiny apartment above an old bakery. The walls were thin, and every morning they woke up to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of trucks rattling by. But they were happy, or at least that's what most people assumed. Marianne looked bright-eyed whenever she talked about Peter. And Peter, though not overly talkative, always had a relaxed, content look when he was around her. They saved up all their spare change in a big jar on the windowsill, labeling it Boat Fund. That jar became a symbol of their future, an unspoken promise that they were going to make something of themselves. In 1982, Peter finally got the engine running. He officially started offering short tours around Lake Wyndham, capitalizing on the small wave of day trippers who passed through town in the summer. It wasn't a huge success, but it was something. Marianne would sometimes help out on the weekends, handling bookings or chatting up people at the dock. They even talked about marriage a few times, though nothing was set in stone. Her parents gently hinted that they wouldn't mind seeing her get married, but Marianne felt she wasn't quite ready. She wanted more stability, a little more time to figure things out. That's about when the first cracks started to show, although some folks in Brookfield claimed they never noticed any trouble at all, maybe because Marianne and Peter kept their problems private. The big rumor was that Peter began to feel restless. He'd come to Brookfield on a whim, and even though he'd built a life there, part of him still dreamed of living in a bigger place. He started taking short trips out of town, telling Marianne he was searching for boat parts or trying to scout locations for future endeavors. Maybe that was true, or maybe it was just an excuse to get away for a bit. Marianne, for her part, was content in Brookfield. She had her job at the real estate office, she had her parents close by, and she had that apartment that felt cozy despite the traffic noise. Come autumn of 1983, Peter seemed more distant. He'd stay out late, sometimes not coming back until after midnight. Marianne tried to be understanding, but she'd wait up for him in their living room, the TV playing old reruns in the background. According to a few friends, she started crying more easily, letting tears slip out when she thought no one was looking. Some folks whispered that Peter might have met someone else in a nearby town, maybe a waitress or a nurse, but nobody had any proof. Brookfield was a place full of gossip, so it was hard to separate fact from speculation. One day, Marianne's father fell ill, and she had to cut back on work hours to care for him. She found herself emotionally exhausted, torn between supporting her family and trying to keep her relationship intact. Peter helped at first, driving her to the hospital, making sure her father was comfortable at home. But soon enough, his own stress about finances and his scattered dreams pulled him further away. Their arguments got louder. Neighbors in the bakery downstairs could hear their raised voices late at night. Marianne wanted Peter to stay close, to be stable and present. Peter felt caged, too young to be locked into a routine he wasn't sure he wanted. By early 1984, the tension was overwhelming. Marianne confided in an old friend that she wasn't sure if Peter still loved her. He was gone more often than he was home, and when he was around, he barely spoke. She suggested counseling, but Peter brushed it off. In a small town, counseling was a rare concept back then. People usually kept their problems behind closed doors. So Marianne tried everything else. Cooking his favorite meals, leaving little supportive notes in his tool bag, planning short getaways to nearby towns. Nothing seemed to work. Late that spring, Peter left Brookfield altogether. Some said he packed his belongings in the middle of the night. Others claimed he stormed off after a heated argument. Whichever version is true, the end result was the same. Marianne woke up one morning to find he was gone for good. He didn't leave a letter, just took the old boat and disappeared. Folks around town felt bad for Marianne, but nobody really knew what to say. She moved back in with her parents for a while, helping her mom take care of her father. The boat tours fizzled out. Soon, a sense of sadness settled over Marianne's life, like a heavy curtain that was hard to lift. For the next few years, Marianne focused on her job and her family. The real estate office had picked up a bit because the 1980s brought some new development around Brookfield. She poured her energy into that, eventually earning enough to rent a small house not far from her childhood home. People noticed that she never really mentioned Peter. If anyone asked about him, she'd just shake her head and change the subject. Then something unexpected happened in the late summer of 1987. Peter came back. Nobody saw him arrive. He just showed up one afternoon at the dock, the old boat in tow. It was battered from years of use, or maybe neglect, and he looked older, tired, like he'd been through a rough patch. Word spread quickly that Peter had returned, and soon enough, folks were speculating about why he was there. Some guessed he wanted to make amends. Others thought he was broke and had nowhere else to go. At first, Marianne refused to see him. She locked her front door when she heard he was in town and avoided places where he might appear. But Brookfield was small, and eventually, they ran into each other at the grocery store by the highway. Witnesses said it was an awkward meeting. She was standing in the produce section, picking out apples, when he walked in. They supposedly froze, staring at each other like they were strangers who recognized a familiar face but couldn't place it. Then Peter tried to speak, but Marianne grabbed her groceries and left before he could form a sentence. Over the next few weeks, Peter made attempts to talk to her, leaving notes at the real estate office, calling her old landline number, even standing outside her parents' house once. Marianne ignored him until he finally cornered her on the sidewalk downtown. pleading for a moment of her time. She didn't want to cause a public scene, so she reluctantly agreed to sit on a nearby bench and hear him out. A couple of people passing by overheard bits of their conversation. They said Peter admitted he'd been foolish and selfish, that he'd run away because he was scared of being tied down. He claimed he'd spent years regretting it, drifting from job to job, never feeling settled. And while Marianne listened, her expression remained guarded. Nobody knew precisely what Marianne said in response, only that she walked away looking angry, and maybe a little sad. Peter stayed on that bench for nearly an hour, staring at the sidewalk. A few days later, though, folks saw them talking again, this time in a quieter corner of the park. Little by little, it appeared Marianne was letting him explain himself. Some people saw them share a laugh by the lake just like old times. The rumor was that Peter apologized over and over, promising he'd changed, that he wanted to earn her trust back. Marianne, having spent years mending her life on her own, didn't just melt into his arms. She had a strong sense of self by then, and it was going to take more than mere words to fix what was broken. They spent the better part of 1988 sorting through all the anger and confusion that had built up between them. Marianne wasn't quick to forgive. She'd been hurt, left to pick up the pieces of her life, and she wasn't eager to risk her heart again. Meanwhile, Peter took on odd jobs around Brookfield, repairing fences, painting houses, anything he could do to show that he intended to stay this time. Slowly, trust began to form again, but it wasn't like the naive hope they'd shared in their early 20s. It was more cautious, more questioning. Some afternoons, they'd sit together on the edge of the lake, talking through all the what-ifs that had haunted them. Other times, they'd lapse into silence, neither quite sure how to heal old wounds. When the 1990s rolled around, people saw a new dynamic between them. Marianne had become independent, practical, and confident in her choices. Peter had grown humbler, more willing to accept responsibility for his mistakes. They never did marry, at least not according to local records, but they formed a kind of partnership. They lived in separate houses for a while, each paying their own bills, each maintaining a sense of individuality, but they kept meeting up. They'd go to the diner on Friday nights or watch a movie at Marianne's place. Over time, it became clear that they genuinely cared for each other, though it was a different sort of love than the starry-eyed one they'd shared in the past. In 1995, Marianne's father passed away, and Peter was there, helping with funeral arrangements, comforting Marianne's mother, driving everyone around. That gesture didn't erase the heartbreak he'd caused years earlier, but it showed Marianne that he wasn't running away this time. He was willing to stand by her when things got hard. Some folks figured that might finally push them to tie the knot, but it never happened. Perhaps they'd learned that official paperwork wasn't what made them committed to each other. Into the early 2000s, Marianne and Peter remained a quiet but stable presence in each other's lives. Some days they were inseparable, other days they gave each other plenty of space. Townspeople got used to seeing them side by side at community events, helping out at charity picnics, attending holiday gatherings, sometimes even working on small renovation projects together. If you asked either of them about marriage, they'd just shrug as if it wasn't a priority. They seemed to have moved beyond the question of rings and vows. They had something else, a hard-earned understanding that love isn't always neat or straightforward. Sometimes it's messy, full of mistakes and reconciliation. By the time smartphones and social media became a big deal in the late 2000s, Marianne and Peter were just part of the Brookfield backdrop. New families would move into town and learn their story in bits and pieces, usually from curious neighbors or the longtime owners of the diner. Young couples facing their own relationship challenges sometimes look to Marianne and Peter as an example, proof that people can drift apart and still find a way back together, though not necessarily in the way they first imagined. Even in 2010 and beyond, they kept to their routine. Coffee at sunrise by the lake, a walk in the park on Sunday afternoons, a quiet dinner at Marianne's place. When asked if she ever really forgave Peter, Marianne would say forgiveness wasn't a one-time event. It was something she had to work at every day. And Peter, for his part, admitted he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for his disappearance. If you asked them if they believed in soulmates, you'd get different answers depending on the day. Some days Marianne would laugh and say, "Life is too complicated for soulmates." Other times Peter would nod and insist he was sure Marianne was his, even if he'd messed up 1,000 times along the way. That's the story people in Brookfield like to tell. It's not a fairy tale with a perfect ending, and it's not a tragedy where everyone ends up miserable. It's just real life. Two people who fell in love, fell apart, and then found a way to piece things together again. though never in the exact same shape. If you ever pass through Brookfield, you might catch a glimpse of them. Two older faces, quietly content, standing by the lake they once dreamed of turning into a grand tourist spot. It never became that, but it remained a witness to their ups and downs. And in the end, maybe that's enough. A little slice of everyday love and heartbreak, whispered about in a small town, told and retold by those who remember what it means to hurt and to heal.